public contract must be awarded based on the most economically advantageous tendered award criteria. The so-called meet must be identified based on the price or cost, using a cost-effectiveness approach such as life cycle costing. So what does it mean that life cycle costing is a cost-efficient approach? Cost or price will form a part of any tender assessment, and often it will be one of the most crucial components. In practice, until not so long ago, the main focus, though, has been solely on the acquisition price. However, it is just one of the cost elements. Life cycle costing is to be understood as a method considering all the costs that will be incurred during the lifetime of the products or works or services. On this slide, you can see a graphic representation of how life cycle costing could look like, specifically within graphite pencils, production and acquisition. The picture also illustrates how Article 220 of the directive defines life cycle. According to this provision, life cycle means all consecutive and/or interlinked stages, including research and development to be carried out, production, trading and its conditions, transport, use and maintenance throughout the existence of the product or the works, or the provision of services, from raw material acquisition or generation of resources to disposal, clearance and end of service or utilization. Recital 97 of the directive also includes the outcomes of the Dutch coffee case, where the court ruled on fair trade issues. It specifies that the life cycle includes factors involved in specific process of production, provision or trading and its conditions of those works, supplies or services, or a specific process during a later stage of the life cycle, even where such factors do not form a part of the material substance. Article 68 specifies and enriches Article 67.2 on awarding criteria regarding the cost that might be considered. There are two types of costs arising during the life cycle. There are costs borne by the public buyer or other users. These costs include, let's say, acquisition. This could be delivery or installation, use, for example, consumption of energy, maintenance, for example, repair costs, end-of-life costs, such as collection and recycling or other disposal costs. The efficiency of LCC approach relates to the fact that thanks to it, a public buyer can get a real picture of total price of its purchase and achieve the value for money throughout including different types of costs. A good example here is the LED light bulb. Its acquisition price will be higher than a regular light bulb. Therefore, if only that price were considered, a regular light bulb would be the winning bid. However, if we consider other costs, we will see that initial pricier LED light bulb might be a better solution. LED will have a lower usage cost due to its energy efficiency. It also lasts longer. Therefore, the maintenance cost will be lower than a regular light bulb that might need to be exchanged more often. Not to mention that LED will also be recyclable. The other costs that may be considered are those imputed to environmental externalities linked to the product, service or works during its life cycle. These costs are not reflected in the price of what public buyer is procuring. Usually the cost relates to environmental externalities and are borne by society at large, rather than the specific public buyer. These costs include the cost of greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutant emissions, or other climate change mitigation costs. Environmental externalities might take into account solely provided and insofar as the monetary value can be determined and verified. In other words, it needs to be possible for the public buyer to put a value, a monetary value on the cost of the environmental externalities. It follows from the AVN Wienstrom case that it is prohibited to apply environmental externalities cost if public buyer has either no way or intentions of verifying them. Now, I would want to say a couple words on social life cycle costing. When we talk about life cycle costing, the focus is predominantly on environmental consideration. This is presumably because the fact that Article 68 expressly relates to environmental aspects only. Considering social elements, the only indication comes from Recital 96 that states the feasibility of establishing a common methodology on social life cycle costing should be examined, taking into account existing methodologies such as the guidelines for social life cycle assessment of products adopted within the framework of United Nations Environmental Programme. The lack of explicit reference to social aspects in Article 68 shall not be read as prohibition of social consideration in the LCC methodologies, but rather connected with their infancy or challenges in their implementation. Social LCC will still have to meet the same requirements of objectivity, monetization in Article 68, which undoubtedly pose challenges. Social life cycle costing are harder to monetize. Some of the examples of monetizable parameters that could be included in LCC are the impact of unemployment, education, and health of a public contract. Now on to life cycle costing methodologies. The public buyer applies, or while the public buyer is applying LCC, should indicate in the procurement documents the data to be provided by the tenderers and the method which the public buyer will use to determine life cycle costing based on those data. The data required can be provided with reasonable effort by normally diligent economic operators. Additionally, life cycle costing methodology must fulfill several conditions to a large extent corresponding with the requirements for labels under Article 43. Firstly, it shall be based on objective, verifiable, and non-discriminatory criteria. It echoes the prohibition of discriminatory procurement design provided in Article 18.1 on EU procurement principles. It also indicates that unless applied in general, understood here as repeatable and continuous, life cycle costing method which lessen discrimination concerns, the method shall not unduly favor or disadvantage certain economic operators. Finally, the life cycle costing methodology shall be accessible to all interested parties. The availability of LCC methodologies varies depending on the relevant economic sectors. Whenever an LCC method has been made mandatory under EU law, this method must be applied. A list of those methodologies, currently only one, is included in the Annex 13 to the Directive 2014. Clean Vehicles Directive in its 2009 version required minimal public buyers to take energy consumption and environmental impacts, emissions into account when procuring road transport vehicles. It provided a methodology for monetizing these impacts to assess operational lifetime, energy and environmental impact cost. However, since then the directive has been updated and the methodology has been dropped in place of establishing relevant targets that are to be met rather than application of specific methodology.